Hi guys, welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk about maybe one of my favorite movies of the year, The Substance. Oh my God. Go into this movie knowing as little as possible. Spoiler-free breakdown. This is as much as I'm going to give you. It stars Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley. Basic setup here is that Demi Moore is a aerobics instructor. She's basically like Olivia Newton-John, right? And she's famous, and this big Hollywood producer is basically saying, hey, you're kind of aging out of this. You're starting to look a bit old. I think we're going to give you the axe. She basically finds out about this, and she is offered a drug. She finds out about a drug that allows her to be her younger self for 7 days. She gets to be on this cycle where she turns into a younger version of herself for 7 days and then turns into her current self for 7 days. And as long as she keeps that 7-day rhythm of her current self and then her younger self and then her current self and then her younger self, nothing will go wrong. Obviously, something goes wrong. That is as much as I can give you. Spoiler-free thoughts. This is an incredible commentary on beauty standards, our relationship with aging, our relationship with our current self and our younger self, who we want to be, who we used to be, specifically through the lens of the female experience for sure. This is directed by a woman who also did the film Revenge. She is a master at her craft in terms of body horror and viscera related to the female experience. I think both of the films, Revenge and The Substance, are excellent, but I really don't want to give any more away about this movie. Go in knowing as little as possible, even the trailer if you can avoid it. If you're not hooked already, maybe check it out, but you have to see this movie. There are visuals in this movie that I cannot get out of my head. I woke up the next day genuinely thinking I had had a fever dream. Like, I went and saw this movie at 9 p.m. It ran into midnight. I woke up the next day and was like, did I dream that, or did I see what I saw in that movie? On top of that, this movie is 2.5 hours long. It is excellently paced. From the moment she gets the substance, the movie just goes and goes and goes. And I know sometimes 2.5 hour movies can be daunting. Every time this movie, I thought it reached the pinnacle of messed up and horrifying and insane, it would do something more. It reminded me a bit of Poor Things. I know that's a bit of a controversial movie. I loved Poor Things. And with Poor Things, every time I was like, oh, there's no way it can get better than this. It did. And in The Substance, every single time you're like, oh, they surely can't take it further than this. This must be wrapping up soon. Even though I'm loving it, don't stop here. They would keep going. For me, as an audience member, I was sitting there in a pretty full theater, by the way, watching this insane, artsy, horrific, crazy, dark comedy movie, just going, do more, please do more. And it kept going, it kept pushing the line. Every time you're like, they can't do more than this, they did. Incredible. Also, on top of that, a really interesting thing going on with the marketing for this movie, right? Because Demi Moore is going on these press circuits, and she's like a prestige Hollywood actress. She is a golden age Hollywood actress. So I feel like all these women her age are going, oh, Demi Moore's done this interesting movie about aging and our relationship with our bodies and this female empowerment body positivity movie. I'm going to go down to the movies and see it.
Very unique way of really delving into, I think, a very relevant subject matter, which is aging, the perception, the collective consciousness of women's value diminishing as we get older.
And they are in for a total shock because this is an R-rated in Australia, so NC-17 rated in America, movie that is basically a masterpiece of body horror. And there were 2 old women that were watching this movie in my theater who clearly went in going, oh, it'll be an interesting movie about Demi Moore and aging. And they made it 2 hours. Like, credit to them, they made it 2 hours, and with 20 minutes to go, they were like, nah, and they left the theater. One of the funniest experiences I've ever had. But on top of that, it was really interesting because a lot of teenagers saw this early screening on a Friday night, clearly expecting just a dumb Blumhouse horror movie or something, and they were actually hooked. It was really interesting to see. I was really nervous when they sat down, but they sat there and were horrified and captivated. So I think this is a crowd-pleasing movie. And going out of the theater of one of the most fucked up, insane movies I've ever seen, everyone seemed really happy and satisfied with it, which is just really rare that you are able to have a really artsy, abstract, out there movie that actually works for mainstream people. Super, super fascinating. But this is a great commentary on aging and also resentment down the family line. There are angles in this movie that almost are examining the idea that, mothers or fathers kind of resent their young children for what they represent and what they no longer have. Super interesting. Super, super interesting. So let's get into a spoiler discussion about this movie. First off, the movie looks incredible. I've given given you the basic setup. I really just want to get into some interesting plot things that jumped out to me. So basically, the big reveal here that you don't get in the trailer is not only is she turning into a younger version of herself, she is actually producing a weird kind of like clone that comes out of her. She gives birth to a younger version of herself. What I really liked here, though, is it's not just a younger version of herself. It is a different young version of herself. We've seen Demi Moore in this movie when she's young, and what comes out is Margaret Qualley. So that's, first off, really interesting. But what happens is when she takes the substance, right, Margaret Qualley, like Alien, right? Like the Alien horror movies, Margaret Qualley spawns out of Demi Moore's back, and now Margaret Qualley is in control of their consciousness. So the setup here is that basically Margaret Qualley's body is here and Demi Moore's body is here, and they share a consciousness. So the consciousness will go into Margaret Qualley, and then after 7 days, Margaret Qualley needs to plug into Demi Moore and let the consciousness go back into Demi Moore. And then Demi Moore walks around for 7 days and then plugs back into Margaret Qualley, and then Margaret Qualley gets the consciousness. And the movie is absolutely hitting its stride when they start competing for time. Now, it is important to note that the voice that explains the substance to Demi Moore basically says, hey, you guys are the same person. You need to remember that. Even if it feels different, you are the same person. Choices you'll make as Margaret Qualley are the same you'll make as Demi Moore. You are the same person. You cannot start competing because it is just you. And it's really interesting because this movie is clearly exploring the fact that when you're in it, you can't help but feel like a different person. So Margaret Qualley starts taking more than 7 days, which starts leading to a deterioration of Demi Moore's body. So Margaret Qualley, for example, let's say she takes like 8 days. When she goes back into Demi Moore's body, Demi Moore is now experiencing gangrene and deterioration on her hand and then her leg. You know, it's speeding up the aging process on Demi Moore's body if Margaret Qualley takes more than 7 days. It needs to be perfectly balanced, or the young one starts taking the life force out of the old one. But what's really interesting here is both versions start calling the leader of the substance going, oh, this bitch is taking too much time. This bitch isn't listening to me, yada, 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 yada. And what's so interesting is that they are the same person. I don't think you're meant to be seen here as an audience member take it as, oh, they're different people. They are actually competing. I think what's actually happening is it's a representation of how you resent different versions of yourself. You know, if you say you're going to be on a diet and then you have a massive cheat meal and pig out on your diet, the next day when you're sitting there looking at your old self and your previous decisions, you have some resentment. You know, there's this really interesting scene where she transforms back to Demi Moore, and Demi Moore just sits there as a couch potato eating potato crisps. And then when she turns back into Margaret Qualley looks at the indentation on the seat with like resentment, like, look at how fat you are, look at how pathetic you are, look at how you treat yourself in your body. I'm never going to do that. I'm young, I'm hot. And it's the same consciousness. And I think this works as a really good metaphor for, how we beat ourselves up for our own previous choices. You know, when I was really out of shape and not taking care of myself and my mental health, I look back on that with disdain. I can't believe I let myself do that to myself. And I think this movie really captures that. I think even if you're not a female, there is so much interesting stuff going on here. On top of that, there's this great section. The older version, Demi Moore, is like tearing up the house and watching interviews on a late night talk show with Margaret Qualley and screaming at the TV and just like filled with disdain and resentment. And yes, obviously she's envious and jealous, even if she just has to wait 3 or 4 days to turn back into that. But she hates what Margaret Qualley has done to her body because she's becoming more and more deformed, more old, more grotesque. And I think this really serves as a really great allegory and metaphor for the way like some women get really resentful for what the process of giving birth has done to them, right? So at this point in the movie, it actually feels like a weird, demented exploration of mother-daughter dynamics. You know, often toxic mums in movies and TV shows and in real life go, oh, you know, you fucked up my body. Oh, you know, I put my body through hell to give birth to you. You fucking nah. That's what it feels like this movie is capturing. It's really uncomfortable and icky. Also, I forgot to mention, I absolutely love the sequence where Demi Moore actually says yes to a date with with this guy because she feels so bad about how she looks, and this guy really thinks she's beautiful, but she chickens out of the date and can't do it because she's looking in the mirror. And even though she looks good, she looks like Demi Moore, she doesn't look as good as Margaret Qualley, and she just doesn't go on the date. And it's a really good parallel because later in the movie, which I will talk about, she turns into this like horrific mutated monster, and then the mutated monster combination of both of them in this like delusional state kind of gets really confident and like straightens the one little strand of hair she has left and goes out and hits the town. But the movie just keeps taking it further because then both of them start breaking the rules. So in this really interesting moment, Margaret Qualley decides she's just going to keep taking and taking and taking, and she starts forcing more and more life force out of Demi Moore's body and basically like never turns back into Demi Moore. When she finally has to, when she finally gives in, gives up, passes out, and lets Demi Moore take control of their consciousness, right? Demi Moore is this grotesque, kind of like the witches looking thing, like horrific, mutilated, morphed, aging body. It's actually grotesque now. Like before, Demi Moore looked incredible at 60, like absolutely incredible. That's another thing in this movie, right? Like Demi Moore is not happy with how she looks. I think most people her age and even younger would kill to look like her, but now she does look like a monster, and she can't go back. Nothing she can do can change her current true self back. You know, the only option she has is to keep turning back into Margaret Qualley. But there's this great section where Margaret Qualley and Demi Moore like kind of come up with this idea to completely break it, and somehow both versions for a split second are actually alive. I like this too because when you find out about the initial premise and you see that it's 2.5 hours, you're kind of sitting there going, oh, I wonder if they can break the rules and then both of them are alive for a bit. Imagine how interesting that would be. On top of that, I also wondered, oh, I wonder if Margaret Qualley, if she takes the substance, what happens then? Can she give birth to another one? Can it just keep going and going and going? And this movie explores both of those in a very satisfying way. Through some convoluted means, they mess up the little procedure, and now there's a young Margaret Qualley and an old Demi Moore facing off. And at that point, I do think the consciousness is split. Margaret Qualley wins, but now she's like deteriorating because she doesn't have the old self to transform back into. So she's losing teeth. She's losing blood. This young version can't survive without the old version, similar to how the old version needed the young version around too. And then you get the ending. You get the last 20, 30 minutes. So Margaret Qualley, in this desperate like attempt to remain her young, beautiful self, I believe takes a last expired dose left of the substance into this alternate version of herself that shouldn't even exist. And she turns into this hideous, grotesque, like I can't even explain it to you. You need to see this movie, but she turns in to this absolute hideous monster. It looks like the Book of the Evil Dead where like things are misplaced. So there's like an ear on her like butt, and there's half a face of Demi Moore sticking out of its back, and her face is like up here and down here, and there's like a boob over here, and she gives birth at one point. She like vomits up another boob. It's insane. It's absolutely like I have never seen anything like it. Like if you've seen The Fly by David Cronenberg, it's kind of like that when the fly comes out of Jeff Goldblum into the true horrific fly at the end. But it's like this insane amalgamation of Margaret Qualley and Demi Moore and just like horrific body horror skin that doesn't make sense. And like it's insane. It's insane. And then it goes on TV. It goes live on stage where Margaret Qualley was meant to be performing because she's like beautiful, right? And instead it's this like insane monster, and like, you know, people try and kill it. And then it explodes. It gets blood everywhere. And then what you get is there's this like weird placenta thing that comes out, and it's just Demi Moore's face on like gore. It's Demi Moore's face on like a bit of intestines, and it starts slinking its way up to Demi Moore's character's Hollywood star where she dies. She kind of melts into just generic goop and then cleaned up by like a cleaning machine on Hollywood Boulevard. You know, this is obviously a commentary on how Hollywood will take young starlets, use them up, spit them out, and leave them with no work once they don't look young and generically beautiful anymore. You know, Hollywood is notoriously and notably cruel to aging women. They stop getting roles, they get left out on the side. On top of that, Hollywood is cruel to women in general, and that's clearly what this movie is showing, because Demi Moore ends up just a face on the street that dissolves and melts into goop and then swept up by a Hollywood cleaning machine. This movie is not subtle. All right, this movie is not subtle, but my God, it's fucking awesome. And yeah, I do just want to like circle back to my interpretation. I stand by the interpretation that older Demi Moore resenting the younger Margaret Qualley really does feel like mother-daughter, like kind of like sparring. And I really do like the idea that both of them get this idea that the other version of themselves is a different consciousness, even though they're the same consciousness. They keep calling in this state of delusion and panic. They keep calling the leader of the substance, being like, she keeps doing this, she's going against my will, and he keeps going, you're the same person. And I think we are meant to take that at their word. And what I think it represents is this kind of disassociation you do with different ages, different eras, different people that you are throughout your life. You know, I look back on things I did when I was like 13, 14, 15, and it feels like a different person. I resent who I was when I was younger. And I think that's what this movie is capturing. I don't think you're meant to be seen there being like, oh, like that they are different people. No, I think they're just in denial. Because like the level of disassociation you'd be having when you look at choices that Demi Moore is making compared to choices that Margaret Qualley is making, and how society treats Margaret Qualley compared to Demi Moore would completely crack your brain. You see how men kind of ogle and worship and really care about Margaret Qualley, and then they don't give a fuck about Demi Moore. It's got a really interesting view on objectification as well, because the way men and Hollywood treat Margaret Qualley is incredibly objectifying. They're basically making her do porn instead of aerobics, compared to Demi Moore's, which did actually feel like aerobics. Margaret Qualley is basically twerking in front of a camera and you can see everything, right? And I think it does a really interesting thing about, like, it almost seems like Demi Moore was treated so poorly as she was aging by these Hollywood executives, by these shitty men who were just cruel about her body and her aging, that when she becomes Margaret Qualley, she's suddenly like brainwashed and okay with being completely objectified, completely treated as a mindless sex object. And she knows it, but it's like after years and decades of being treated like an aging, undesirable object, in her brain, it's like, this is better. Like, even if I have no agency, even if they're just saying yes because they like looking at my butt all the time, like, it's better than what I was experiencing, so I guess I'll do it. And it's really interesting because it makes you wonder if she was her initial timeline young. Like, if it was just Demi Moore 40 years ago when she was young, would she have been okay with being this objectified? Or is it because she's been through so much as she has aged that becoming this young version Margaret Qualley, she's suddenly okay with it? It feels like a breath of fresh air. You know, if men were ogling her when she was the real younger, right? You know, 40 years ago or whatever, would she have been perturbed and disturbed? Whereas now, because it's like she's seen what it's like to be forgotten and not kind of worshipped and not acknowledged as you get older, is she suddenly okay with it and appreciative of it? I think that's a really interesting and messy subject matter, but also reflective of what we see in today's society. You know, I turned on the news the other day and there were women who were like 50 talking about the fact that they feel like after a certain age, they've just been completely ignored by society. You know, they used to get chairs offered to them and people would give them attention and like they were respected in the workplace. And now that they've got older, it feels like they're completely disregarded. And it feels like that's what this movie is exploring in those sections where the Margaret Qualley kind of lets herself be objectified and kind of lets herself get carried away just because it feels like such a refreshing change from being ignored as she's gone older. I think this movie is really, really interesting. It's not subtle. All right, it's as subtle as a sledgehammer to the teeth, but it's incredible. And the visuals you see, like, I can't even do it justice. Absolutely insane. The dialogue also feels very Stanley Kubrick. It reminded me a bit of Yorgos Lanthimos, but less funny. But everyone talks like they're in a kind of different reality. It's a bit strange. The best way I can explain it, and I'm not sure if the director is foreign, but it feels like it's a foreign script that then has been translated into English, and they've kept that kind of weird sense of like lost in translation. And it really adds to the weird, ethereal, strange feeling of this movie. Absolutely check this movie out. It is disturbing in its gore and its body horror, but it doesn't lean into any angles of sexual violence, which I was kind of expecting. So I think most people can handle it as long as, you know, you're okay with some gross out, humorous, horrifying gore. But yeah, I loved this movie. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.